This week's episode of the Tech Report podcast is brought to you by Be Quiet. Check out www.newegg.com/store/be-quiet for a look at their full range of cases, power supplies, and CPU coolers. Our thanks to Be Quiet for their support. Welcome, everybody, to episode 189 of the Tech Report podcast. I'm Jeff Kampman, the Editor-in-Chief of the Tech Report. We are at techreport.com, and we're your number one source for news and reviews in the PC hardware world. Tonight, we have a very special guest with us, Mr. David Kanter of Real World Technologies and Senior Editor of the Microprocessor Report at the Lindley Group. Did I get all that, David?
I think you got everything. Good evening, folks. It's great to be back. And I guess I have the honor of being the first guest of the year.
Yes, first podcast of the year, too.
Yeah.
Very honored to have you back. So, tonight we're going to discuss a startup called Soft Machines. And Soft Machines has recently revealed some information about a microarchitecture they're developing called VISC. And they've also released some performance numbers that they're expecting to hit for their VISC chips when they hit silicon. And they're exciting. There are some big performance improvements potentially on the table, but we also wanted to take a look and see just how valid those assumptions are. Some of the assumptions they made are in the real world. And so let's, I guess, do a brief introduction of Soft Machines. Like I said, they're a startup. They've been around for several years now. I think the first we heard of them was in late 2014, and then they were quiet for a while again, and then they introduced some details of their processor roadmap and architecture in December of last year. And then just about, I want to say, a little over a month ago, they released some performance targets. So they're a relatively new technology. But kind of one of the sort of startling claims that they put forth is that their VISC architecture can produce a 2 to 3 times instructions per clock increase, and up to 4 times. They've revised this a little bit now, but it's up to 4 times as much performance per watt as some competing architectures. And those numbers are, if you paid attention to like desktop CPU performance increases over the past few years, like we're happy to get like single digit percentages in instructions per clock and stuff like that. Is that accurate, David?
Yeah, well, I mean, you'd see 5, 10, 15%-ish. But yeah, right. I think the numbers they're throwing around are pretty big, which is nice. But, of course, the real question is, what's the baseline?
Right.
And not just that, but then also, how are they doing it? And I think my exposure to Soft Machines has been actually considerably longer. I think I probably first ran across them in 2011 or 10. I mean, they're actually quite an old company. Mm-hmm. But I think their technology has actually changed, and some of the first things that they were doing are a little bit different than what they're doing today.
Mm-hmm.
So
let's talk now a little bit, I guess, about sort of what they're doing, what's different versus like say like a traditional Intel CPU or something like that. So with the average CPU, you have one instruction set architecture. That machine runs that and nothing else. And, that's it. But, what Soft Machines is VISC, one of the things it's doing, they're talking about taking guest instruction set architectures, like for listeners who are familiar with virtual machines, they're sort of taking this concept and making instruction set architectures portable. And so there is so below the operating system, below, the hypervisor, you have this software layer that, this, I guess, sort of converting between their, the guest ISA and their native ISA. So in theory, this could run like x86. It could run ARM, and
it could run anything in theory.
Right. And
but so this is not novel tech. That aspect of it isn't novel.
Right.
And so, in general, running a different instruction set is challenging because each instruction set has its own set of idioms. Right. And just an example of that is in ARM v7, all instructions can be predicated. That's a giant pain in the ass to emulate. x86 has a bunch of fairly complex instructions that are difficult to handle and has, sort of obnoxious things like the flags that get set on a lot of operations that are also, you sort of need specific hardware to handle. And, as we've discussed before, this is not, that aspect of it is not dissimilar from Transmeta or NVIDIA's Project Denver.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. So the really interesting thing about this kind of, what they've done is they're also virtualizing the concept of what is a core. So the front end of So
that's a concept that's actually really old and dates back to probably the mid 90s. Right, just going back, there was, maybe you can remember, but at one point there was going to be a 10 gigahertz Pentium 4.
Right.
Or derivative. And
right.
Part of that is that everyone knows that the best way to get more performance is higher clock speed.
Right.
Right. But architecture is, fundamentally about the right trade-off between what physics gives you on the manufacturing side and what, you can get in terms of IPC and what the software wants. And so, there was a project at the University of Wisconsin-Madison called Multiscalar, and their idea was, well, look, what if we take a thread of execution and break it up into multiple chunks, and then we can have those chunks execute on different resources. And, this was really before people were talking much about multi-core processors, right? And, if you multi-core processors for the PC world weren't really much of a thing till probably 2004, 2005. So again, very old academic concept. And so, in some sense they are virtualizing, the core, but really the way, I look at it is, there's a family of techniques known as speculative multi-threading, which, if you go back to basic architecture, right, we have something called speculative execution, which is where you're running along, you hit a branch, boom. Well, okay, you can execute the branch and figure out where you're going, or you can speculate past the branch and guess what instructions you need to do. And that's speculative execution, right? So now to take that concept a level further, you can say, okay, let's have speculative threads. So maybe we have this big program that's millions and millions and, let's just say billions of instructions, and we're going to break it up into a bunch of different chunks. And we're going to go along with normal instructions per cycle. So maybe we're getting, on a really good day, we're getting 1 to 2 instructions per clock in one thread. And we say, look, I'm going to pick my favorite workload to make this easy to think about. But let's imagine we have a loop that's just doing it's like LinPack. You're doing a bunch of multiplies in parallel, right? And you're going through a huge array. Well, you could look at that, and any of us could look at that and say, well, gosh, we've got this loop. It's going to have a couple billion iterations. Well, why don't we just divide that up into, 0 to 1 billion, 1 to 2 billion, 3 to 4, and so on and so forth. And each of those can be on a separate core, right? And you can do that in software today, but the hardware won't do it automatically. And so the idea of speculative multi-threading is that through some combination of hardware and software, you let the hardware take this code that's, nominally single-threaded and then break it apart into multiple, you can call them strands, as that's the term we used at my startup. Strandera, you can call them threadlets, as Soft Machine does. I believe Sun's Rock processor called them microthreads. But the whole idea is you've got this, now instead of just having instructions executing speculatively, everything about it is speculative. And so then the trick is, like an out-of-order processor, we need to be able to take two threads, let's say. One is architectural, one is speculative, and we want to execute them, and then when we're done, stitch them together correctly. And when something goes wrong, then we need to cancel the speculative thread. So that's the idea in a nutshell. And this is something that's been worked on for a long time, and I'm fairly familiar with it. I started a company. I was the co-founder of a company that did a lot of work in this area, and we talked to Intel, we talked to AMD, we talked to a lot of different folks about this, and it's not easy. But the one thing I can say is that it is possible to get fairly significant performance gains, but it's and to let's throw some numbers out there. At Strandera, we were looking to do something that would get, we thought that we could probably get about 2x the performance of maybe state-of-the-art Intel chips at the time, which I think might have been Nehalem or Westmere.
Mm-hmm.
But that was using 4 cores, or maybe even more, right? But the key thing is that we had a way. So we were using transactional memory, like what's in Haswell. Okay. And then we had a translation layer, just like Soft Machines. Mm-hmm. But unlike Soft Machines, we would do x86 to x86 and just add in the transactional memory.
Right.
And so then that transactional memory, you use that to define what a speculative thread is, so that then when something goes wrong, you just say, cancel that transaction. We're dead.
Okay.
And that made everything work really nicely. And so we had shown in simulations, which, if you're an architect, that's kind of what you got to work with, that there were benchmarks in spec where we could use 12 cores, which is pretty impressive. Mm-hmm. So, looking at Soft Machines just to start with, I think it's an interesting area. I know there's something to be had out there, and I think the real question that we want to get at is, well, okay, what are they possibly doing? What have they shown, and what does it really mean? Because it's a very tricky area in terms of the benchmarks.
Right. So do we want to take a look at what they've released now, then, or because they? Yeah. Okay, sure. So what they put out, just a little bit ago, were a couple of graphs of Spec 2006 performance. And before we get into that, I guess we should talk maybe a little bit about what Spec is, because it's a commercial benchmark. I think it's a pretty expensive commercial benchmark.
Well, it's not quite commercial. So Spec is a nonprofit organization.
I got you. Okay.
But it does cost $600. So, expensive is relative. It's not expensive relative to an engineer's salary. But,
sure.
I'm not going to go out and buy it just for larks.
Right.
And so Spec it's actually a workstation benchmark, and there's it's a collection of tests. They're distributed in source code form. You can compile them yourself. And it's sort of the standard benchmark for microprocessor performance. And it's not the best benchmark in the world, right? The best benchmark is always the application you're going to run.
Right.
But what is, whoops, I think my video turned off. Okay. Hopefully that won't happen again. but it's a collection of different tests that are all designed to be computationally intensive. Mm-hmm. And so there's the integer tests and the floating point tests. And, the floating point test is actually probably a pretty good proxy for high performance computing. Mm-hmm. But a bunch of the tests have been broken by compilers in various ways. And so it's not perfect. And, in general, my favorite, one of the subtests is GCC. And so what it does is it compiles some code. And that's nice because it's a very complicated program. And one of the real issues with spec is some of those benchmarks are very small. And when I say small, I mean, if you look at like a web browser, that could easily be 100 megabytes of code. Mm-hmm. The spec code size is usually going to stay in your L3 cache. It's
right.
A couple megabytes. So there's some things about it that are unrealistic. The control flow is not as difficult as real programs are. Like if you look at a C++ application, there's branches all over the place. And so Transmeta had this problem where they had worked on spec very well on Linux. And then the first thing that happened is they booted up Windows, ran spec, and, raised the white flag and said, we need you to design a different chip. Right? And it's just, code is different everywhere. Mm-hmm. So, but nonetheless, it's sort of the standard benchmark for microprocessor performance. And even if it's not a great benchmark, architects everywhere will pretty much agree on what it means and which parts of it are bogus and which ones are not.
Mm-hmm. So the numbers that Soft Machines released included a number of assumptions about some of the competing chips that we probably want to talk about.
Yeah.
So first off, I think we agreed that maybe the most egregious thing here is that the number they've produced is a geometric mean of both like the integer and floating point tests, which is, right, to my understanding, a very unusual way of presenting that data.
The geomean is actually what you would do, but the way spec scores are reported is you get a number that is a geomean of all the integer tests, and that's your mm-hmm. spec int score. And then you get a geomean of all the floating point tests, and that's your spec FP score. The thing that's really questionable is, well, why the hell would you average the two of them? Mm-hmm. And in particular, it's questionable because a lot of the floating point tests are highly regular code. They're well structured, using languages that make things easy to auto-parallelize. Mm-hmm. And so as a refresher for the audience, Intel has a phenomenal compiler, IBM as well, and Sun as well. And so they have in various cases cracked benchmarks and taken what is single-threaded source code and then spat out multi-threaded binaries, which is a pretty cool thing to do. Mm-hmm. But it's also not very practical because in reality, that kind of letting a compiler do that tends not to work for real applications. Now, for spec, some of those tests are simple enough that it's fine. And so this is where things start to get really sticky, is that, well, if we know a compiler can do it, then it's got to be brain dead simple because a compiler only has static information. And the right. thing that's hard is, like, if you look at Fortran code, you can figure out where all the pointers go. Mm-hmm. And in C, you cannot. And so I might have this giant 5 billion iteration loop, but if it accesses data through pointers, I have no idea where that data really is, which means I might have different iterations of the loop all touching the same data. And so then if I try to execute them in parallel, I could end up, doing some sort of really bogus operation that just corrupts everything.
Right.
So, as you pointed out, it is not informative to have a geometric mean of spec int and spec FP. Number one. Number two, because, as I said, a lot of the benchmarks have very particular behavior, like the real architect in me says, I want to see each individual score, right? I don't want to see the geo mean. I want to know where you win and where you lose, right? You know, just like in the reviews, you know, one of the things I love is, of course, you get the summary graph of like 99th percentile frame rate versus price, and that's, you know, informative. But if what I really care about is The Witcher 3, you know, the rest of it doesn't matter.
Right. And so, and then I guess some other, you know, a couple other things that are kind of interesting in their approach. For example, you know, they I guess we should talk a little bit about like where they expect these cores to go. Like Soft Machines is positioning itself as a kind of an ARM-ish company, and that they will license their intellectual property, like their cores, to other manufacturers who want to incorporate it into their products, but they're not going to make products themselves. And so, you know, we're looking at, you know, mobile power budgets up to like, I guess, you know, low power convertibles, sort of ultra low voltage notebooks kind of deal, something like that. So this is not like a Core i7 6700K fire breathing kind of CPU.
Right.
They do say like server performance in a mobile power budget or something like that, for what it's worth. And so,
yeah, I mean,
so they're you know, so obviously ARM cores are a natural kind of comparison point. I guess Apple's A9, which is, you know, it's an ARM core, but a custom ARM core is, you know, another point. And they also pulled out a mobile Skylake CPU. But with our A72, the ARM A72, one of the assumptions they made there is that there's, you know, a 3.3 gigahertz ARM chip out there, which is, I don't think, the case.
Right. So a lot of those numbers were simulated or adjusted in various ways, and I think maybe the right thing to do is to step through what those adjustments are.
Sure, absolutely.
So the first thing is the A72 that they looked at was a MediaTek chip, and you know, MediaTek is generally reasonably good about implementing ARM cores, but you know, their power management is still many years behind Intel and AMD, and probably behind Qualcomm and Apple. So you know, it's probably a good implementation of an ARM core, but it's not the best. It's also a 28 nanometer part. So let's, you know, and they're talking about a core that's nominally going to be a 16 nanometer part. So, you know, right from the get-go, it's not clear how fair a comparison that is. But, you know, the point of this is not, oh, we're going to beat the A72. It's like, here's a rough idea of performance. And I think when I look at Soft Machines and I look at their value, I'm not very interested in their core design because, to be perfectly honest, I doubt it's going to be as good as what, you know, a competent, well-heeled company can do. I think what's interesting is, okay, we've got this technology that lets us do speculative multi-threading. How well does that work? Because if that works well, then, you know, the theory goes that a bunch of people ought to be interested in using it. Because if I can use 2 cores to get, you know, double my single-threaded performance or increase it by 60%, then I can clock them back by 20 or 30% and cut my power down a lot.
Right. And that's,
or I could just go for more performance. I mean, either way, it's just a pure win.
And that's a major thing that they brought up, is that the way their power scaling works is that because you can add more resources at lower clock speeds, you don't have to consume as much power to get more performance. You know, sounds good. You know, so. Yeah,
you know, that is a very attractive story to tell. There's no question about it. And I think, the real issue is, okay, well, what is the story that they're actually telling? And so, some of the adjustments they made in here, so as you said, they picked a bunch of chips to compare against. And I think those were probably the right chips to compare against.
Right.
But then they said, well, let's try to adjust the L2 or L3 cache size to make it constant. And that's not really, there are reasons to do that, but at the same time, the reality is no one competes on an equal playing field. And, if you want to take Apple's, the A9X or A9. Right, which has 3 megabyte L2 and a 4 megabyte victim cache, and then you want to go lop off a bunch of the cache. Well, the truth is that Apple's circuit designers, if they wanted a smaller 1 megabyte cache, it would be much faster. So, in some sense, you're looking at that architecture and you're handicapping it while they still pay the penalty in terms of latency of a large cache. So that's kind of unrealistic. And the same goes for the adjustments that they made to the core, I guess it was an i5-6200U. Right. And so, if you think 1 megabyte L2 cache is the sweet spot, that's fine. And that's your opinion. That's Soft Machines' opinion, given their architecture, given their physical design, and given the process they chose. Other people with different process technology will make different choices, especially, a company like Intel or Apple, where, they might not think twice about saying, okay, we just want the densest SRAM in the world. Let's go throw a bunch of, cache designers at the problem and make it go away. So that's sort of one area where I would question the comparison. And then the second, and this starts getting into things that are a little bit more subjective. Well, actually, no, let's go to your simulation point. So,
sure.
When they talked about these chips, right, as you said, well, there is no such thing as a 3.3 gigahertz A72.
Right.
Totally true. And moreover, that's not really the operating envelope it's designed for. So, it's sort of like saying, let's take a look at this Toyota, at this Honda Civic, and we noticed it's really bad at hauling trailers up a mountain. And it's like, well, of course, you should have bought the Chevy Tahoe. Right?
Yep.
You use the Honda Civic when you live in San Francisco, not when you live in Lake Tahoe. There's a little bit of that, but the idea of looking at the IPC of an A72 or of an A9 or a Skylake, and then looking at how that's going to change with frequency is not a crazy thing to do. And architects do this all the time. And, the trick is you have to be sure that your assumptions are right and that you account for the memory subsystem. But, if an architecture team came to me and said, here are our simulations and, here's what they look like and here are the conditions, I could be talked into believing that they have a reasonable idea of what it would look like. Of course, the real issue is, they're probably not competing with an A72, but with the next generation. But leave that aside for the moment.
Sure.
So, they have simulation, and simulation data is great until you can get silicon, and then you really need real data.
And I think after and I was going to say, at the time they gave us this data, they had said, this is all simulation. This is our internal our internal performance simulator. Another site did, another article on Soft Machines, and they verified that they are now in the stages of testing silicon. So hopefully, maybe we'll learn more about that soon. But
Yeah. I mean, the other thing to point out is that, simulators, there's different levels of accuracy you can get.
Right.
And, you could be within, really good simulators, which are very computationally expensive, might get you within 1 or 2%. More approximate simulators could get you within 10 to 20%. But it also depends on your assumptions. And when you're talking about performance, that's actually a lot easier to simulate than power. Because when you're looking at power simulations, you're looking not just at the software and the chip and what it's doing, but then you have to make assumptions about the process technology you're on, which, oftentimes you make those assumptions and then, TSMC comes back to you and said, haha, just kidding. That's not how the process actually works. It's going to burn more power. Right. And, you know, like that was a well-known phenomena with like TSMC's 40 nanometer process, and that kind of bit NVIDIA in the butt and some other folks. So, you know, the performance numbers are probably better and more stable than the power numbers.
Right. And that does fit with what they told me, because I did ask about this. I said, you know, well, this is a simulation, you know, how do you expect this conforms? And they'd said, you know, based on because they had a 28 nanometer test chip, I think, running at 500 megahertz. And they said, you know, well, when we did simulations for that, we got, I think, within 5% on performance and 10% on power. I think something like that. Right. So there's that. And I guess do you want
right.
So in SimPoint, and they're talking about, you know, they're using SimPoint, which is, I guess, a way of like looking at certain points in a program and saying how does it behave at this point, and then sort of extrapolating out.
Yeah.
In general, is that correct?
Yeah. So I'm guessing that what they do is they probably checkpoint execution, and you know, so you go through. And then you say, okay, here's the zone of interest. You know, maybe it's a couple billion cycles. Maybe it's 1 million, you know. Your simulators typically tend to run in like, if you want to be within a couple % of accuracy, you're going to be running at the simulator will run at like kilohertz speeds, maybe hundreds of kilohertz, maybe up to like a megahertz or two. So, you know, you'll have a short snippet of the program that you execute. So, the place where things get really hairy, and that I think is fine in general what they're doing. You know, at Strandero, we did the same thing. We used, a tool that my co-founder developed called, PTL Sim. And so, you know, that's pretty much standard stuff, and I don't think it's going to raise any eyebrows. I think the thing that really, to me, raises questions is, they're making a comparison using GCC 4.9.
Right.
And GCC is a fine compiler, but let's be clear, it's not one that is carefully optimized for spec. And, you know, if you look at Intel's compiler, at IBM, at Sun, and other commercial compilers, they will typically spend a fair bit of time and money on just optimizing the crap out of spec.
Right. And I guess we should say, you know, there are various points at which you can like try and optimize for these things. Like some people try and put it more in hardware. Some people try and put it more in the code. And so.
Well, I mean.
Or not the chip, not the code, but yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so the thing that the compiler will do, and this is a great example of something that's super unrealistic to do in practice, is I believe one of the benchmarks uses a sort of array of structures data approach, and it's more cache friendly if it's a structure of arrays, I believe, or maybe it was the other way around. But anyways, it actually like goes around and behind the programmer's back changes the data structure so that you get better caching behavior. And you know, on one hand, like I look at it and I'm like, damn, it took some compiler engineers serious effort to make that work. That's impressive. On the other hand, that won't work in real code. So, you know, that's fine. But the point is, those kind of optimizations can get you a factor of 5 or 10x on one benchmark. And there's probably 4 or 5 benchmarks that are broken. Well, there's at least 2 that are easily optimized that I can remember off the top of my head, and that would be MCF and libquantum. But there are others that can be really broken by an aggressive, what I would call benchmarking compiler, like Intel. Right. Now the thing is, the guys at GCC don't really care much about benchmarking, so it doesn't do any of this fancy data structure conversion. It doesn't do auto-parallelization. So when I look at this, the question I have as a skeptic is, can you prove to me that you're doing something that Intel's compilers can't do? Because if all you're doing is recapitulating what Intel and IBM and Sun have done through the compiler, that's not the most interesting. It's impressive, but it doesn't, the only way it pushes the state of the art forward is it takes what is a super fragile static compiler optimization and now makes it somewhat dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
But it still might be very fragile. We don't know. And so, that's one big question is, okay, well, how well does this work on, pick your favorite ugly code base, whether it's, Firefox might be a good example, or, something that's written in C++, very complicated. There's like UI elements, something nice like that, or, some JavaScript. And the compiler settings they used were aggressive. So it's not like they were going out of their way to make the alternative look slow. Mm-hmm. It was GCC 4.9, 03, optimized for a Cortex A57. Although in all fairness, I think if they were, they might want to have optimized for an A72, but that may not make a big difference. But again, the issue is, and had they shown individual benchmark data, it would unquestionably answer this. Right.
Right.
Did you see a big gain on something like GCC, or was it just on libquantum and MCF? Right. And I think as an architect, that would be the big question on my mind. Along with, the biggest question, which is like, let's go look at some real code, some real applications, and see how this does.
Mm-hmm. This week's episode of the Tech Report podcast is brought to you by Be Quiet. Be Quiet is a premium brand of power supplies, PC cases, and cooling solutions for desktop PCs. Consistently the leader in the German PC power supply market since 2007, Be Quiet is one of the most successful PSU brands in Europe. Be Quiet's Silent Base 600 and Silent Base 800 cases combine sound dampening materials throughout with tool-free features and premium PureWings 2 fans to maximize ease of use, cooling performance, and quiet operation. For more information, visit Be Quiet's Newegg store at www.newegg.com/store/be-quiet. Our thanks to Be Quiet for making this week's episode of the Tech Report podcast possible. Talking a little bit about, I guess, Soft Machines' architecture, we don't actually know a whole lot about what's going on inside the chip, I guess.
Yep.
Yeah. And I think you had talked about me on Twitter, like, how are they getting all this stuff to communicate with itself? Like, they're using the register file to do inter-threadlet communication, or just... Mm-hmm. And so what are the sort of the advantages, disadvantages, risks of that approach versus, like, say, what you were doing with, like, transactional memory? Because, like, my understanding is you're inviting a bunch of risky conditions with
Right. So let's kind of look at, maybe the right way to do is just like shoot down the pipeline and look how these things actually tend to work.
Sure, absolutely.
And I'm not going to talk specifically about Strandera or Soft Machines. I don't know much about exactly what Soft Machines is doing because they've been really light on details. But generally speaking, you're going to encounter some bit of code that you've seen before, and you think it's really likely that it will be amenable to parallelization. So, like, a great example is maybe you're doing a call, right? So you're calling some math function to calculate interest on this bank account, and then you're going to go back and do something else. So you could actually take a look at that and say, well, hey, this call can be done in parallel with the code that comes after it.
Right. So
the first thing is you've got to identify these potentially parallel regions. And, what could go wrong here? Well, if you mispredict the branch, and let's say you didn't, calls are actually eliminate this problem to a certain extent. But let me just give you a really bad example of what goes wrong. Let's say you get an exception in the middle of that call. Well, then you're never going to get back to where you were, or if you do, something's going to be really different, right? Who knows exactly what the exception was? It could be, your heatsink fell off, time to shut down gracefully, right? In which case performance is not an issue. But it could be, you get a network packet in and you need to go handle that and switch threads or whatever. So that's the control flow aspect, right? Which is about your branches and where control is executed, and you need to make sure that's predictable. And it's just like with a branch predictor, if you speculate too far and you can't predict correctly, you end up wasting power.
Right, because you got to throw away all that work.
Exactly. But now what this does that's even more complicated is now we have two separate threads that are manipulating data. And so now we have this potential of getting bad data in. And so, that is an issue. But we also need to be able to pass data between these two threads. So let's, I'm going to take a slightly simpler example. Let's say we've got a loop that's again about 1 billion iterations, and we're just going to cut it up into 10 chunks, and each set of loop iterations will be one thread. Well, if those threads don't need to talk to each other, that's great, but that's a trivial case that a programmer could have handled in the first place using OpenMP. Right. Boring. Although, admittedly, there's a lot of code that people don't optimize because they're just lazy. So, while it's not technically super interesting, it could result in real gains. Right. But what's more common is you might have some data that flows from thread 1 to thread 2. And so you need to pick how you're going to communicate that. And I know that in Soft Machines model, they can communicate through the register file. And so as a practical matter, that means you're probably talking about maybe 50, 60, maybe 100 different values that you can communicate. So that might limit how big those chunks are.
Right. The threadlets or the inter-process or inter-thread communication packets. So the inter-thread, the communication between the threadlet, would need to, in that context, fit in the register file. Now, there are some indications that they may be, and I think your article sort of suggested that they may actually be communicating through the caches now, like what we did at Strandera. Right? And if that's the case, then instead of only having 100 values, which, you want to throw a number around, call it 4 or 8 bytes of value, that's 800 bytes. Well, your L1 cache is 32 kilobytes. So if you can communicate, that way, thousands of values quite easily. Right. And so that would mean you can do a big chunk in parallel. Now, in all fairness, you probably get a bigger, ideally you want to be able to handle small chunks and big chunks both. And we definitely saw a lot of gains for big chunks. We were looking at things that were on the order of, we wanted our speculative threads to be somewhere between 100,000 and 1 million instructions. So that's really big. If you're passing data through the register file, you might have a speculative thread that's only 50, 60, 100, maybe 1,000 or 2,000. But then the overhead of creating that threadlet and then merging it back in might be high. So that's, so when you need to communicate the data, that's one issue. But then the other thing is, well, what happens if, thread 1 does something and overwrites data in that thread 2 had already read. Right. Then you need to go squash thread 2. Yeah. Right. Yep. And that's tough. And you need a way to detect that sort of data conflict. And at Strandera, we did that through the cache coherency protocol. There are other ways to do it.
And in the register file, there's ways to keep track of it, but you need to do it. And then you need to make sure that you don't falsely cancel things, right? That would be bad also.
Right.
So, the question is, when you go through and form these threadlets, how do you choose them so that there's a very small number of data values being communicated? Because each one of those data values could potentially shoot things in the foot.
Uh-huh.
So, I think from a technical perspective, my big questions are, okay, what are the heuristics you use to form your threadlets? How much data can you communicate between them, and how long does it take, right?
Right.
If I can just pass a value in one cycle between the register files, that's really good. That's impressive. That's great.
Right.
But on the other hand, that means those two register files had better be right next to each other because you can't have a big wire between them.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So, and then, how much time does it take to cancel a thread, a bad threadlet? How much time does it take to merge in a good threadlet? What are the limitations on threadlets? Can they only, can it only be 1 million instructions? Can it be 10 million? Or, do you prefer smaller threadlets that are more frequently merged back in? And then how do you, something that I'm not aware of a solution for yet, so what I'm saying is at Strandera, we did a lot of this. And so I know there's answers out there. And, the guys at Soft Machines are smart. I'm sure they came up with pretty good answers for a lot of these. One thing that I'm not familiar with is if you're doing this virtual CPU, this speculative multi-threading, how do you keep two separate sets of speculative threads properly ordered according to the ARM and x86 memory ordering model?
Uh-huh.
And so that's something that I think is a very interesting open field of research. And, I'm also, so again, how do you form them? How do you keep multiprocessor coherency? How do you detect, sort of data violations?
Right.
How do you handle them? And then the other thing is, it's pretty clear that they're using some sort of translation layer. How much of that is in hardware and how much of that is in software?
Mm-hmm. Right. And, we just don't know yet. So.
Yeah. Well, and in all fairness, like the Soft Machine guys, they believe they're onto a multi-million-dollar idea. They don't really want to give their competitors heads up. And, the one thing I can say is, look, we worked with Intel, we worked with AMD. They knew some of our results. They knew, generally speaking, how we were doing things. There's nothing to say that those companies don't have similar research projects going on. And if I was Soft Machines and I had something that worked, I would not necessarily want to give away the secret sauce to competitors.
Sure. All right. Well, I'm going to take a look real quick at our outline here, and because we do have some reader questions, and we should probably go ahead and move on to those. Because we just talked. Okay, so this is good because we just talked about register sharing. So reader asks, how does the register sharing between cores differ from the dual register file setup implemented in the DEC Alpha 21264? That
EV6 is the other name for it. So, right. So it's actually pretty different. So the EV6 and other designs had issues with the number of registers that are being read and written. And so just like, let's talk about some circuit basics. When you make a register file cell, you really want as few read and write ports as possible.
Mm-hmm.
So, and to throw down, like when you look at SRAM, with an SRAM, like in a cache, you get one read or one write per bit cell.
Mm-hmm.
With a register file, and that will use 6 transistors. If you want to have a read and a write, that will typically require 8 transistors per bit. And it just goes up from there.
Right.
So when you're looking at a register file where you're like, I might need to be able to read something like 8 times and write to it 4 times, which is not at all unreasonable in a microprocessor, all of a sudden things, you're starting to look at like, oh my God, this register file is going to be out of control.
Mm-hmm.
And so what the alpha guys did is they said, well, no. What we're really going to do is we're going to build 2 register files that are mirror images of each other. And so one handles half the reads, one handles the other half of the reads, and then I got to write to both of them. So it lets you make much easier, 2 smaller register files instead of one massive, big, honking structure that your physical designer and your fab guys will not like. So what we're talking about here is actually 2 functionally separate register files with different data that somehow have a mechanism to communicate.
Right.
So it is, conceptually quite different, in many respects from what the alpha guys did.
Okay, and he also asks, do all the registers have to be shared between cores? I.e., can there be a distinct private register set for each core and then a public register set for the bare minimum coherency necessary?
Yeah. So, and that's really a great question. And so that, the answer is, if I were doing it, I would probably have some private registers and some shared registers, because those shared registers need to communicate. So you might want those to be closer to each other than the other registers. So you could have all of the registers able to have shared values. Some of the registers, maybe it's fixed, maybe it's variable, right? Where you look at the threadlet and you say, this guy is going to pass 8 values out to the next guy, so I'm going to make 8 of these registers shareable so that they can be read by the other thread. That's one way to do it. Another thing you could do is you could say, well, I'm going to give this guy his own 64 registers. This other guy has 64 registers, but I'm going to have a separate special bank of registers that both guys can read. That would be another way to do it. So there's a lot of different ways to make that happen. And ultimately a lot of that will come down to what's the most physically implementable way of doing that. And certainly you don't want everything to be shared, because that's just hard. Because, if everything's shared, at some point, all you've done is like you've taken a single core and kind of cut it in half and like done some weird stuff and made your life difficult.
Maybe this isn't a good analogy, but mesh topologies are hard. In general.
Yeah, no. Well, that's what you're actually, the way I would look at it is a little bit different. Is, in a mesh topology, the idea is I only want to communicate with my neighbors on either side, right? Because if I want to, you're in Indiana, right?
Right.
The wires between San Francisco and Indiana are very long. The wires between San Francisco and LA are much better. Right? And so, a lot of what drives a mesh topology versus a crossbar is the realization that we want wires to be as short as possible. And so that's going to be the same thing that drives what goes on in these register files, is we want the communication to be over a very short distance.
Right. All right. This is another one from he's full of questions. So, considering that Soft Machines' own research demonstrated diminishing returns past 4 cores per virtual core, would future iterations of the individual cores start to become wider, like the traditional cores from Intel /ABM/IBM, etc., and further increase single-thread performance?
Right. Yeah. So I think if Soft Machines is able to, successfully go to market with a processor, in a second generation, they would absolutely look at that. And the right way to think about this is they might choose to go with, 2 narrower cores instead of one slightly bigger core. Right? It's just another tool for the architects to figure out what's going to be best. And, our initial experiments at Strandera seem to suggest the same thing, that 4 cores sounded like the sweet spot.
Right.
So once you've got 4 cores, then you probably want bigger, better cores, bigger, better caches, and other things like that, exactly as your reader suggested.
Okay. I'm good. Yeah. And because their roadmap suggests, so I guess, so the roadmap right now is like their processor that they expect to be available as, I think, did they say RTL? Yeah, it's RTL, later this year, is 1 to 2 of these virtual cores across 2 physical cores, and then you can put them together in SMP configurations if you want, to get more cores. And then, so then the later generation next year, they say, again, I guess it's just, so more virtual cores across the same number of physical cores, SMP on 10 nanometer, whatever. But then, 2018, they're saying, I guess, 4 cores is the top of their roadmap without engaging SMP.
Yeah. So. I mean, the other thing is, to be perfectly honest, when you're a chip startup, the roadmap is somewhat meaningless, right? The only thing that matters is getting number 1 out and starting to make money.
Right.
And really proving that it works. So, I would look at this, and I think the sort of analysis you're doing and saying, okay, our hypothesis is that more than 4 cores might be a stretch. The roadmap seems to validate that. I think does lend weight to that idea. But by the same token, if someone came along to them and said, look, I'm going to ship 100 million of these guys, but I really need a way for this to work with 8 cores, you can bet the first thing that's going to happen is they're going to go back to their engineers and say, all right, guys, time to make it work with 8 cores. Right. Again, I think the biggest motivation is showing that within the ARM ecosystem, they really can boost performance because, that's a big ecosystem. There's a lot of people who would be interested in that.
Mm-hmm. All right. So here's a long one. I think, okay. Yeah. So this is the last one we'll do, from that he says architectures like Transmeta's Crusoe and NVIDIA's Denver have software translation layers like VISC, and their real-world performance can vary widely due to how well the software is able to compile/optimize to the native ISA. However, Soft Machines' first core isn't translating from ISA to ISA, but just generating threadlets from existing code. Should any performance predictions be taken in this context as well? What would run particularly well on this architecture, and what tasks would be a poor performer? Any general performance predictions compared to x86 and ARM?
Sure. So, generally speaking, this kind of these family of techniques, first of all, will not work for interpreted code.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So now keep in mind there's a difference between JITted code like Java and interpreted code. But if it's interpreted code, that means that every time you execute a statement like with PHP, unless you're using hip hop, you're gonna create the code from scratch. So when you're running interpreted code, every bit of code you've never seen before, so you don't have an opportunity to really optimize it.
Gotcha.
So that's a known problem. On the other hand, if you're using an interpreted language, you probably didn't care about performance in the first place. The place where this really is very likely to work is anything that looks like HPC, where it's kind of regular code, well structured, nice. That kind of stuff will be much more amenable to this sort of optimization.
Sure.
Now that being said, when I say that interpreted code won't work, what I should be really cautious here and say, I'm not aware of solutions to make interpreted code work. It's possible that the Soft Machines guys have something up their sleeve. I don't know.
Sure.
One of the issues about the ARM ecosystem is Android is a hugely important OS.
Right. Absolutely.
Right. And some of their code is JITted, some of it is interpreted. So, if I was targeting that very seriously, I would spend a lot of time focusing on how to make interpreted code go fast. Now, one of the things, so when we were at Strandera, we were originally designing hardware like Transmeta. Mm-hmm. And eventually I was able to convince my co-founder that competing with Intel was a terrible idea, and the right thing to do was to make a software layer that sits on top of an x86 chip. Mm-hmm. Or as, I put it pithily, why do we want to bother trying to figure out how to translate x86 code into something else when we could just start with the world's fastest x86 chip running underneath us and make life easy? Mm-hmm. And so, there's a little bit of that going on, right? Which is, you've got your special architecture underneath, but, how much, do you really want a new architecture, or, would it be better to modify? Is it even possible to modify an existing ARM core to support this sort of stuff? Mm-hmm. But, so Transmeta and a lot of, translation techniques, they have problems with large code bases because a lot of the time is spent in code that you'll never see again and therefore isn't worth optimizing. So the ideal scenario is where you're running code where 80% of your time is in the same code.
Right.
If it's only 40% of your time is in the same code, well then Amdahl's law says best case, you're going to get about a little less than a 2x speed up.
Mm-hmm. All right. So user NTMBK asks, how feasible would it be to run mixed instruction sets on VISC if, say, some deep-pocketed company with lots of system-on-chip design expertise wanted to gradually transition from Intel to internal ARM designs? Could they license this tech and make a hybrid x86/ARM strikeout MacBook, hypothetical laptop? So the question here is, would a company like Apple, who's known from time to time for transitioning between CPU architectures, be interested in this as sort of a way to
make that fly?
Yeah.
Right. So, the answer is yes, you could use this to do that. But I think as a practical matter, there's no reason why you would need their technology to do so. You could do that with Transmeta in the first place. Mm-hmm. So, one of the interesting things is, so Transmeta had the first x86-64 chip ever.
Okay.
Because they looked at the specification that AMD put out and they said, all right, let's make our translator read that in and make it run. No problem. Right? Yep. And it's really cool what you can do with that.
Right.
So, is binary translation a potential tool to allow, a transition to a different instruction set architecture? Absolutely. But the truth of the matter is there's not a lot of value in doing that. Realistically, I think binary translation is only interesting if you lost your source code, or if you're doing some sort of really interesting transformation, which is what the SMI guys are doing, right? Mm-hmm. They're trying to take single-threaded code and make it multi-threaded.
Right.
That's worthwhile. But just using binary translation to switch between architectures, in my opinion, does not buy you a whole lot.
Sure. And, Apple probably has an ARM-based version of OS X ready to go in any case anyway.
Yeah. So. The other thing is, let's be honest, problem number one with this hypothesis is, you need something to replace Intel across a vast swath of product lines.
Right.
Right. And so, it might be possible in the MacBook Air, who knows, but, are you really going to is Apple going to produce a workstation chip that's going to rival Intel? Probably not.
Sure.
Not yet. Never say never.
Sure. And, okay. And, all right. So who else? Okay. So yeah, he had a couple of questions. All right. So he says, let me ask you a tangential question. NTMBK says, given the layers we see in these diagrams, the actual cores appear to be rather boring, while the software abstraction layer and the hardware quote-unquote global scheduler that produces the quote-unquote virtual CPUs appear to be where the action is. My question is, how easy /hard /impossible would it be to take a regular CPU and attempt to re-implement both of those two upper layers in software? Obviously, the global scheduler would be much more efficient as a pure hardware device, but given a sufficiently powerful CPU with cores to burn, could you try to fake what VISC does using regular hardware? And I think we just said this. Totally, right? Because this was what you did at Strandera, I think.
Yeah. You need a lot of performance monitoring support in the core itself to look at what the loads and stores and branches are doing. Mm-hmm. But yeah, at the end of the day, like, our plan was to take an x86 chip, and, we even had demos using hacked microcode and things like that of, here's how it would potentially work. And we didn't get any special hardware. We had microcode access, but, mm-hmm. anyone who does an x86 can get that. In the ARM world, it's a bit harder because they don't really have microcode. Mm-hmm. They probably, yeah. So, okay. But, yeah, I think that's.
So I have to apologize. That was actually Chuckula's question. So now it's been attributed to the proper source. Okay. So do we have any? Okay. So Dr. Domino Dog 51 asks, what are your thoughts on how and why x86 instructions have become so important? And do you, and or David think that the x86 reign will ever end, and if so, to what? Intel made good chips and got really popular, and instruction set architectures tend to be pretty stable over time, and if you got one that works, you stick with it.
Yeah.
Is that a reasonable analysis?
Yeah, and not just that. If you look at the history of it, there are instruction set architectures that have died off, but usually it's been for economic reasons. But like, if you look at IBM's Z architecture, their mainframe. Mm-hmm.
Yep.
That stuff, there are still people running 24-bit, 31-bit code from God knows when. And, there's not that many customers for it. There's somewhere between 10 and 15,000 mainframe customers in the world.
Right.
And, this dates back to, I want to say S360 was maybe in the 60s or 70s.
Right.
So, the idea of x86 going away is, seems a little far-fetched.
Right.
On the other hand, 20 years from now, who knows? It's very hard to say. Right. And I think what we're really seeing is, different instruction sets tend to take residence in different places. Right. ARM is very big in mobile phones. Intel is big in, PCs and servers. And, mainframes are still alive and kicking.
Right. Because, the stuff that never really goes away. It just gets supplanted unless you have a completely... I'm trying to think of a good example. I'm not really coming up with one. Something's completely dead. Just...
Alpha's dead.
Yeah, Alpha's dead. Because, deck. But...
Right. But,
Itanium is Itanium heading for...
Yeah, Itanium's going to die. Yep. Itanium is basically an instruction set that's produced for HP, and I think, Intel and HP and the other partners, just work out, do they want to continue to pay Intel to develop it, or at what point do they want to toss in the towel and just move to Xeon?
Right.
But, yeah, I mean, look, it wasn't that long ago that the last alpha was sold. And it was discontinued. There was no new development since 2001. So,
right.
These things live on for a very long time in the server world.
Mm-hmm. Because you got millions of dollars into the software and you still need something to run it on. I mean,
yeah,
it makes perfect sense for it to live on. So,
exactly.
So yeah, absolutely. We should, so I think I'm going to make sure I believe that's it for our listener questions that we have taken down. If any of our any of our live audience wants to, chip in a question or two, please go ahead and do so now. We'll get them collected and answer them in order. There's one I want to get to, but this one's still on the topic of soft machines, so we'll go ahead and handle this one now. I think it's Hammer Time Conv asks, how do they implement branches? How does the global front end know which code to decode ahead of time? This comes back to the speculative execution question, I think.
Yeah. So, again, I don't know because they haven't talked about it, but I'm assuming that they only want to have, they want threadlets to be along very easy to predict branches. So the way I would design it is call and return sites. Makes sense. But then the other thing I'd do is I would have some sort of, branch tracking history that, tracks not just what the prediction is, but the confidence of the prediction. And only when I'm super, super, super sure would I allow speculation to proceed.
Okay.
Right. And then the other thing is you want a dynamic mechanism to scale this back.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So if you don't want, the key for all this stuff is you can't waste energy. So you can't misspeculate. So you have to, as soon as you find out that misspeculation is going on, because you could potentially blow away, a full core worth of power, you've got to stop it and make sure it doesn't happen again.
Right.
But, it's hard.
Yeah, absolutely. And, okay, so, David, you were just breaking up a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Are you still, okay, yeah, you're still audible. Okay. Okay, Symmetry81 asks, do you think it's possible to have native code for Java, just-in-times, etc., that might encode an optimized set of threadlets?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is something we discussed at Strandera. This is something that I'm sure Transmeta discussed, which is that you could, in theory, have a JVM that emits your native code.
Gotcha.
It might not be a great idea for a variety of security reasons. So I can't remember his name, but the chief architect on NVIDIA's Project Denver was super clear and said that in theory we could do this, but for security reasons we will probably never do it.
Okay.
Because one of the things is your translator can muck around with everything, and you really don't ever want.
Oh, right. Okay.
That to
be totally
compromised. So there are some security issues there, but it's certainly a possibility, and that would eliminate the penalty of sort of doing a double translation, right? Mm-hmm. That's the benefit.
Okay. All right. We'll see if we want to tackle this one or not. So, DBS7 asks, could you comment on the rumors of AMD adding HBM to their CPUs and APUs and the pluses, minuses? And he says, I've seen asides, this isn't a great idea, but not clear why. Bandwidth versus latency.
Cost is a big one.
Right. So high bandwidth memory is, it's a form of stacked DRAMs that just to bring our listeners up to speed, if anybody doesn't know, that right now AMD uses on what's called a silicon interposer to talk to the GPU. And there's a lot of fabrication that goes into that. Now, to put this on package on package would be pretty difficult to put it on die, I think, but
no. So I mean, the way your HBM works is, right, you've got your logic die on the interposer, and then sort of in the north of it or south of it or whatever, you've got your memory stacks also off the interposer,
right?
And I mean, the question is, could we use a terabyte per second of bandwidth to a CPU? The answer is absolutely. There's a lot of applications that would love it. The real question is, who's going to pay for it? Right. And,
right.
There were estimates that for the Fury X, the memory actually cost more than the GPU.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So, for
not cheap.
AMD, that's really tough, because certainly if Intel has the opportunity to do this, and they, have chosen not to. And that should say something. Maybe it just says that Intel's cheap and lazy and needs a competitor, but, that there's, I think one of the issues is, again, what application areas. In HPC, I could see it being valuable. And, honestly, for a desktop, if I could get 16 gigabytes, 32 gigabytes, I might be happy with that. But there's also, an economic problem, which is that the reason why memory is typically not soldered down in a desktop is you want to be able to mix and match your configuration, so you don't need to have like too many different models lying around, right? Because you've got different CPUs, different memory combinations, different, everything makes supply chain management more difficult for the Dells and HPs of the world.
Mm-hmm.
And interestingly enough, Apple is one company that might be willing to forego that for some, nice advantages.
Sure. So yeah, probably won't see that anytime soon outside of graphics processors, I guess. So
certainly not from Intel. I mean, right. AMD might do something like that. Intel has their own sort of similar, they have their own technology that they prefer over interposers.
Okay. Let me take a look. So that was DBS7. Symmetry 81 asks, do you think that the VISC code translation elides the need for address translation the way that transmetas did? Does it not?
No. So, okay. So, transmeta still needed to do address translation. So I guess I'm not totally sure what the question means.
Yeah.
So if you want to try and clarify that,
sure.
When I think of address translation, I'm thinking of the virtual to physical address translation. And you still need to do that because your original code is going to be, handling virtual addresses if it's a virtually addressed instruction set, which ARM and x86 are.
Yeah, okay. Well, it's an unclear question. It's fine. Freon R2 asks, care to speculate on 16 nanometer timeline for graphics processors? Ooh boy. This is a hot issue. I mean, we do kind of already know that AMD's, at least some chips from AMD are coming out later this year. because they've said as much.
Well, I mean, not just that, but I mean, didn't they show Polaris at CES?
Yeah, absolutely. It was when it came out.
If they have silicon at CES, then it's a good bet that within, typical GPU time frames, I would assume 6 to 9 months within 6 months they will be capable of launching products.
Okay.
Right? Now there's a question of, do they want to, or do they want to wait a little longer? That's sort of, that's a business question.
Right.
Not an engineering question. Now, my hope is soon, because I got a new Skylake 6700K desktop. I'm currently using integrated graphics, which is fine, but I really do need another monitor, and I'm probably going to need a discrete GPU to drive it, and I'd really like that to be a 16 nanometer GPU. So I hope everyone will hurry up.
Right. I think the bigger, so we have sort of a solid idea of AMD's timeline. Don't know what classes those products are going to be in yet necessarily. We have vague ideas, but NVIDIA is sort of a more open question, I think, because they showed off, their Drive PX2, which is the autonomous car computer module thing, and they caused a bit of a snafu because I think someone looked at the date codes on the chips or something, the graphics processors that were on that thing, and determined that they were not Pascal's, and Pascal being NVIDIA's next generation GPU architecture. And so that, the internet being the internet raised some questions about, what their actual readiness is and something like that. And the answer is we really don't know. Because they haven't said quite as much. We kind of know what's going to come with it. They have shown chips with HBM. They've 3D memory, as they call it, but it's just HBM2. But yeah, that timeline is murkier.
Yeah.
So.
Look, I mean, so NVIDIA is probably going to be having Pascals by the end of the year, but they may be for HPC only.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I think, yeah.
Yeah. So there we go.
But they could pull it in earlier. I mean, it's, you never know. I mean, yeah.
Yeah. And it's fine. We really don't know yet. It's still developing. I mean, GDC is in a month.
Yeah.
I mean, we'll probably know a bit more then. So wait and see. Okay, so let's see. What any other questions? I need to make sure somebody isn't just pulling my leg here. Okay, well maybe not. So Power666 asks, when will we see wide I/O and mobile chips? Now, I honestly didn't know what this was. Wide I/O is a
yeah, it's an alternative to HBM.
Okay.
So I have no idea. So here's the thing. It took a really long time. So just step back for a second.
Sure.
I think one of the big issues with HBM is cost. And yield is also an issue, and you need to think about very carefully how you're going to test all your dies separately before they've been packaged.
Mm-hmm.
You find out which ones are good and which ones are bad, right? Because if you stack 4 dies together and you have to throw the whole thing out, that's bad.
Right.
Not only that, but if each die is 99% likely to be functional, then 4 of them together, you only got about a 95% chance of the whole thing working.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay. The thing about wide I/O is wide I/O has all those same problems, but if you're targeting mobile, people in the mobile world are even cheaper than the guys making high-end GPUs, who are much cheaper than Intel, who are much cheaper than IBM.
Mm-hmm. So probably not anytime soon.
I'm not holding my breath. Don't get me wrong, I'd love to see it. I think it would be great, but I don't see a driver for it in the near term.
Sure. All right. So yeah, I think that's the last of our listener questions. So if anybody has something else to ask, please ask it now.
Forever hold your peace.
Yeah. Otherwise, I think we're going to wrap up for the evening. Let me make sure. I'm just going to do one more check here, make sure we didn't miss anybody.
Did you get a clarification about that address translation thing?
No, I don't think so.
All right.
Ooh. Oh man, do we want to get into this one? Yeah, sure, we'll take a quick crack at it. TR Cygnus 1 asks, do you think NVIDIA 16 nanometer chips will support the VISA adaptive sync?
Ooh.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think so. I think G-Sync is still probably making them money. And, they're in the dominant position in the marketplace, and as far as discrete GPU sales are concerned for gamers. And now, FreeSync or VISA Adaptive Sync is becoming more widely adopted by monitor makers, but unless...
Well, hold on.
Sure.
Intel said that they are going to support adaptive sync.
Right, totally.
And so when that happens, I think it's a big deal. But, the other thing I'll point out is that all things being equal, I prefer open and free standards.
Right, absolutely.
But there are some advantages to the technical approach that NVIDIA has chosen to take that could be harnessed for the future.
Mm-hmm.
In a way that adaptive VSync may not quite be capable of, right? Because, in some sense what NVIDIA is doing is they're sticking a little bit more smarts in the monitor,
right,
which unfortunately adds costs. But, what could you do with a little bit more brains inside the monitor is really the interesting question.
Right.
And I think if NVIDIA chooses to go in that direction over time, they could probably find ways to continue adding value.
Right.
And, the other thing is, right, NVIDIA might still choose to hold on to G-Sync as a way to prod the industry in the right direction.
Sure.
I remember talking to Scott about this, and, the irony of this is that adaptive sync is most beneficial for the weakest GPUs.
Right.
And, it's odd, but the company with the weakest GPUs is certainly Intel, and they are certainly the slowest to get on the board with adaptive sync techniques.
Right. And we knew, they've said and like we said, they're going to support it. We just don't know when yet. And we're still, I think, a ways off because I think it's an architectural problem.
It could be fixed in Kaby Lake.
Yeah, I think Kaby Lake is going to be the earliest we're going to see that, and who knows when that's coming, months. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. It'll be interesting to see how it works out. I have a FreeSync monitor here. I have a G-Sync monitor here. I think NVIDIA still it's not you're not getting ripped off by paying more for that experience. It is, I think, a smoother user experience with G-Sync. I think know more what you're getting, as far as minimum and maximum refresh rates go. You can be assured, with 144 hertz display that you're going to get 30 to 144 or whatever. Whereas with,
hold on, do they make these? Do they have any 30, 34 inch IPS G-Sync displays?
I don't think they've gotten bigger than 27.
That's a shame.
Yeah, and I'd have to go look. It's been a while since I've looked, but 27 inch 2560 by 1440 at 144 hertz is sort of the sweet spot for them, I think. I know some companies are making like 28-inch 4K TN panels. Like maybe DisplayPort 1.3 will change that, because you'll have more bandwidth to play with and stuff. But
I'm sorry, but like premium TN panels are just like,
it's sort of an oxymoron.
Yeah, it's sort of like a premium Yugo.
Okay, so Freon points out that there is a 34-inch ultra wide, that's like whatever the resolution for those things is.
It's like probably 38 by
1440. It's still, yeah, I mean, something like that. It runs at 100 hertz, but, you know, you have to like curved monitors. I don't. You have to like ultra wide aspect ratios. I don't. So.
Oh, I love my Dell U3415W.
Yeah.
I am a huge fan. Actually, one of the other things worth pointing out is like certainly we do need DisplayPort 1.3, whatever the new one is,
right,
to get enough bandwidth for a lot of this stuff. I mean, you know, it's amazing to me, like that I'm basically, yeah, I mean, I'm tapped out on a single DisplayPort link today, you know.
Yeah.
So, especially if you really want 444 encoding.
Right. So yeah, I mean, it'll just like, I don't know. I mean, the two-tier model, I don't think, maybe there doesn't have to be like a winner-take-all situation for this. So, you know, NVIDIA can certainly keep doing their thing, and so who knows? We'll have to see. But yeah. So question, there's another one. Someone else asked something.
I mean, the other thing is, you know, open committees and standards are really great, but they can be pretty slow-moving at times.
Yeah.
Right. And I think, you know, I'll be the first to admit to it that, you know, as much as I like OpenGL and it's a great standard, Microsoft has really done a much better job, like running DirectX.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, that's the ecosystem NVIDIA's lived in. And so they've seen that, you know, a lot of times you're better off with a benevolent dictator than, you know, a standards body. And, you know, as to whether NVIDIA is truly a benevolent dictator is an open question. But I think it, you know, the fact is that G-Sync got out there and it did prompt some shifts in the marketplace.
Right.
And
yeah, they should be lauded for that.
Yeah, exactly. And so, you know, the first stab at almost anything generally tends to be proprietary, and I don't think there's any shame in that.
Sure. So, okay, so the asker about Transmeta did clarify their question. He said,
great.
What I read on Transmeta was that they had a way of applying address offsets directly in most instructions once so that you didn't have to do an address translation each time. I imagine you could special case the times when that wouldn't work at the cost of more instructions. So.
Yeah, right. So what he's referring to is that Transmeta's hypervisor, sorry,
mm-hmm.
You didn't call it a hypervisor back then, but the translation
layer
system
needed
about 64 or 128 megabytes of DRAM.
Mm-hmm.
And so it sat in physical memory, could not be paged out. And so it had to move around whatever was normal physical memory. Mm-hmm. And so that additional layer of address-free mapping was oftentimes able to be eliminated,
mm-hmm.
right? And so I think this brings up a question, which is, okay, how exactly are they doing address remapping in the soft machine system? Is it necessary? And if so, you know, I would assume they probably can, you know, Transmeta's patents may be close to expiring now, so
mm-hmm.
they might be able to use those techniques anyways.
Okay.
Right. So,
yep.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So that's probably as deep as we want to go into that. But okay. So we'll take one more question here real quick. And Freon asks, David, Jeff, when do your Rifts arrive? So we ordered an Oculus Rift, when pre-orders opened, at CES. And I believe ours is shipping in March. Did you order one?
I was just planning to go over to Indiana and mug you, actually. No, I did not order a Rift. So I recently got a new notebook, at Scott's recommendation. It's, working out quite nicely. It's a great Asus Skylake-based, UX305 ZenBook.
Right. Yeah.
And then I built a new system with the Skylake 6700K, which would be great to pair with an Oculus Rift, except I'm using Intel's integrated graphics for the moment because I'm waiting for 16 nanometer GPUs. And that actually does bring up an interesting question, which is, those two things do sort of seem like they would go together like warm apple pie and ice cream, yet the schedules are, a little bit askew.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we'll definitely be in the first batch, I think, as far as ship dates go, and we'll be trying to get a review up as soon as we can. But
yeah,
we'll see.
Yeah. I'll have to see if I can convince any of my friends at Oculus to send me a review copy. I doubt it.
Yeah, it's worth a shot, absolutely. Because we played with them. We played with like some really close to production hardware at CES, and I'm really excited for it. So yeah, I think it's definitely worth it if you have the graphics power to drive it. So maybe they can send you one and a graphics card. So. All right.
Maybe I should talk to Scott about that.
Oh yeah, he's got a few graphics cards lying around now.
Yeah.
So, okay.
All right.
Yeah,
so
guys.
We're going to sign off for dinner, gentlemen.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks everybody for tuning in. Thanks once again to Be Quiet for sponsoring this episode of the Tech Report podcast. They are at bequiet.com. You should check out their cases, coolers, and fans and power supplies. We're grateful for their support. So yeah. Thanks. Yeah. Thanks everybody for listening. David, thank you so much for coming on and talking to me. Hopefully we'll get to do this again soon.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah,
okay.
It was a pleasure to join you, and have a good evening.
Okay. You too. Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of the Tech Report podcast. Once again, this episode was made possible by Be Quiet. Check out their Newegg store at www.newegg.com/store/be-quiet for a look at their full range of cases, power supplies, and CPU coolers, including the Silent Base 600 and Silent Base 800 cases.